This is Deep Night Whispers. Tonight, we open a file that was never meant to be found. A photograph, a single captured moment of light and shadow that became within hours the last image of everyone it contained. It was late September in the year 1887. Autumn had settled across the Lancashire moors, drawing its slow grey curtain over the countryside. Coal smoke hung like gauze over the small towns. Children ran home before dark, their shoes blackened by factory dust, and in the narrow lanes, the hum of a travelling show brought colour to the evening air. They called themselves Hargreaves's Grand Curiosity Troupe, a roving assembly of entertainers, acrobats, and oddities. In an age that delighted in marvels, they were both spectacle and sustenance. The posters promised astonishments: the towering brothers, the boneless girl, the human chain, the smallest boy in Britain. For a few pennies, one could see the impossible. The photograph was taken that very afternoon on the edge of the village of Berrowford. A long, bare field had been rented for the occasion. A camera had been hired, one of those great brass-lensed contraptions that required patience and precision. The photographer, a traveling man himself, had set up his equipment with care. He draped the black cloth over his head, bent low and focused upon the scene. Before his lens stood 37 souls, performers, workers, and a few of their children. Behind them, the great tent rose, striped and shining faintly in the pale light of early evening. The air was damp, the kind that carried the smell of rain but withheld the rain itself. Men adjusted their collars. Women folded their hands neatly in their laps. Children stared in solemn curiosity, their faces still from the photographer's warning. Hold steady now. Do not move. And then, the moment. The cap was pulled. The plate drank in the light. 37 figures immortalized in silence, caught between one heartbeat and the next. Hours later, every one of them would be dead. No one in the photograph could have known what the night would bring. The performers rehearsed as they always did, with the strange mix of exhaustion and pride that kept such troops alive. Inside the tent, the air smelled of sawdust, oil, and horses. The great mast, an oak trunk planed smooth and oiled against weather, stood at the center like a cathedral column, its ropes taut and humming in the evening wind. Children played at its base, their laughter muffled by the heavy canvas above. The owner, Mr. Hargreaves, was a man of ambition. He believed himself touched by destiny, born to bring wonder to those who could afford only toil. By dusk, the crowd had begun to gather. They came in their best coats, carrying lanterns that cast trembling halos upon the ground. The wind had sharpened, though few noticed. A distant rumble rolled from the west, not thunder, but the shifting groan of pressure in the coming storm. Inside, the show began. The musicians struck their first uneasy notes, fiddles and drums competing with the restless air. Acrobats ascended ropes that swayed too slightly for comfort. Applause rippled through the crowd, nervous, then genuine. For an hour, the world outside was forgotten. But Wood remembers what men choose to forget. The mast that held the tent aloft was no longer sound. Months of travel, rain, and stress had eaten at it from within. To the eye, it was still whole. To the wind, it was waiting to break. At 9:30, the air shifted. A breath of silence passed through the tent, as though the world itself paused to listen. Then came the first gust. The canvas shuddered. Lanterns flickered, spilling light and shadow across faces turned upward in uneasy awe. Some thought it was part of the act, a trick of wind, perhaps even planned. But the performers knew better. The ropes strained. The pulleys screamed. The mast, that proud pillar, gave one long, mournful crack. For a heartbeat it stood, splintered but defiant. Then it came apart. The fall was total. In an instant, the tent became a weapon. Timber, steel, and canvas fell as one, a living thing collapsing upon itself. The audience never had time to scream. Lanterns burst, the air filled with flame and smoke. What had been music became a roar. Outside, those who had lingered near the wagons heard what they thought was thunder. Then came the cries, faint at first, then terrible. By the time rescuers reached the field, the tent was a single vast shroud. Rain began to fall. Canvas smoked and hissed as the storm sealed the tragedy in water and wind. By the time the first men reached the field, the tent had settled into a single heaving weight of wet canvas and broken timber. The storm pressed it down as if the sky itself had chosen to keep what lay beneath. Those who had knives cut where they could. Others fell to their knees and clawed at ropes with bare hands until the hemp burned their palms. Each slice opened not a doorway, but a pocket of dark air, and out of those pockets came the truth in fragments. A child's hand, a ruined chair, the glint of a brass lantern swallowed by mud. The canvas would not lift as one. It had drunk the rain and grown as heavy as a flooded sail. Men wedged spars beneath it and heaved, only to feel the weight settle back. They learned by bitter instruction to work in spans, 6 feet freed here, 10 feet there, then crawl into the new space and pass out whom they could. Those first were not the loudest. The loudest had come first and then fallen quiet. The ones brought out were limp, soot-streaked, and shock-pale, their hair matted with sawdust and ash. Mothers searched faces that would not answer them. A gentleman in a ruined hat kept asking, very reasonably, if anyone had seen his wife's glove. When it was given to him, he held it to his heart like a found child. Along the field's edge, the wagons became a line of usefulness. A cooper's cart ferried the injured to town. A draper's van gave up its bolts of cloth and became a shelter. A meat purveyor's pony, eyes rolling white in the rain, dragged lengths of fallen pole away so that more sections could be lifted. It was a labor without instruction, a town learning its sorrow by the yard. Inside the main collapse lay the worst of it. The mast had not fallen cleanly. It had shattered. Long staves of oak, sharp as lances, had driven through benches and boards. Where the audience had sat closest to the ring, the seating had gone to tinder beneath the press of bodies. Amid the wreckage were the performers themselves, their bright jackets dulled by water and smoke. The strong man lay curved like a shield over 2 children, his arms locked as if he still held a bar above his head. The acrobat brothers were a single heap at the foot of a snapped strut, their fingers blood-dark and interlaced from a last attempt to lift what could not be moved. The boneless girl was found near the edge, contorted not by art but by accident, her frame turned to a shape that told of a door nearly reached. No one read such moments aloud. They were taken in and passed on in the low speech of the shaken. By midnight, the storm had spent itself, the field filled with lantern light of a steadier sort, carried by those who had come from farm and mill when word spread along the lanes. The churchyard bell did not sound. a courtesy to the hour and to the idea that no single measure could count what was here. Town officials formed themselves as best they could. A magistrate arrived in his cloak, not to command, but to agree that what was being done must go on. The undertaker's lads moved among the lanterns with sheets. A publican sent casks of hot water and bread without asking his bookkeeper's leave. The vicar's wife opened the rectory and found herself, before dawn, presiding over a room of women giving tea to the dazed, cutting away sodden stockings, and searching hair for glass. When the canvas was finally dragged aside and spread flat like a defeated sail, men stood at its edge and did not step upon it. It had become, by the day's work, a shroud. Beneath it, the ground was slick and shallow furrowed, where the weight had pressed down. They marked the deeper gouges with stones, intending, no one said this aloud, to come back and lay wreaths there when they had leisure to remember properly. The count began, as all counts do, with someone making columns on paper that blurred in the damp. Numbers changed and changed again. The injured were carried off and then returned to be named. The deceased were laid out in ranks whose order meant little except that a human hand had put them there. Faces were covered when recognition threatened to split the living open. Where names could be spoken, they were written. Where names could not be had, a description took its place. Woman, dark hair, brooch with bird. Boy, fair, boots patched thrice at the heel. Tokens were gathered in a ledger. Rings eased from cold fingers. A watch stopped at a minute that would become, for its keeper, an hour repeated until the end of his days. Toward dawn, the field took on the stillness of aftermath. Smoke thinned. The last trickles of rain worked their way from the canvas to the grass in patient beads. A horse somewhere coughed in that rasping way horses have after fear. The rescuers discovered the use of silence. They spoke softly, not as piety, but because any loudness felt like a trespass upon the exhausted. The dead among the troupe were counted entire, every face in that afternoon's photograph gone. The camera had captured not a company in its pride, but a ledger to be balanced by night. Their wagon chests were opened and turned to coffers. Out spilled the glittering coins of their profession, paste gems, bright ribbons, brass buckles polished to a deceitful gold. These baubles, chosen once to hold the audience's eyes, now seemed to argue for the performer's humanity, that they had wished to be seen as more than passing amazements. Town and county moved quickly to find a place to receive the bodies. The little mortuary could not absorb so much. A mill by the river was offered, its floor swept, its windows thrown wide to what air would come, its looms silent as parishioners. There the dead were laid, row on precise row, as if order could repair what chaos had done. Women from the charitable society washed faces with lavendered water and tied hair back with plain ribbon. Where a hand could be folded in upon itself to resemble rest, it was. Where it could not, a cloth spared the living the truth. By midday, the first messengers returned from the timber merchant and the ironmonger who had supplied the troupe earlier in the season. One brought a note, firm and defensive, that his yard could not be held to account for what weather had done. Another sent only his clerk and a copy of an invoice. Men examined the broken heart of the mast. From the sound wood of the outer ring to the dark, softened core, the truth could be traced in a single cross-section. Rot had taken hold in the very center, the place least touched by drying air. A sawyer ran his thumb across the inner rings and let it rest there a moment, an old man's gesture of respect for a tree that had stood a century and killed in a night. Insurance was a word that arrived wearing a gentleman's hat. The troupe's policy, such as it was, lay in a valley now soaked at its corners. The clerk from the insurer spoke with the magistrate and later with the families who asked what coin might come of loss. The answers were written in the clipped legal hand that makes sorrow small. Force majeure, act of God, liability limited to fixtures and fittings. Fixtures and fittings had been the first to fall. The inquest opened the next day in a schoolroom pressed into service. The coroner, careful, dry, precise, took testimony that no one wanted to give, and yet gave freely. A rigger described the tremor he felt climb the mast in the hour before collapse, the way a violin string tells truth when a finger presses it wrong. A woman from the audience told how she had counted her daughter's breaths by the flutter of a ribbon while they lay pinned beneath the same bench. A farmhand said simply that he had never known canvas to feel so heavy as if it had learned the weight of who was under it and agreed to keep them. Responsibility became a map that everyone studied and no one could walk. Was it the owner's ambition that stretched the season late into storm? The carpenter's haste at a market town 2 months earlier? The inspector's absence, though there was no inspector for such things, only the hope that a man who makes a living from crowds might love them enough to protect them? The coroner wrote down the words without verdict. He could allocate cause, wood rendered unsound, weather of unusual ferocity, lights insufficient to guide an exit, but he could not assign blame in a way that satisfied the raw math of grief. The burials began before the ink dried. Churchyards took whom they could. Dissenters' plots opened their gates without counting sect. For the nameless and the far from home, a strip of common ground was given over and consecrated by presence, if not by liturgy. Men swung mattocks and found beneath the first spade's bite the spring seep that makes grave digging both an art and an accusation. Coffins were plain. Where there were no funds, a carpenter worked at night and charged nothing. A seamstress stitched shrouds from calico meant for winter shirts and said nothing when a merchant asked after his bolt. In the weeks that followed, the town returned to its labors with the strained politeness that follows calamity. Mills reopened, children went back to sums, yet the lanes held their knowledge. People walked a little out of their way to avoid the field. When they could not, they glanced aside at that flattened circle where grass regrew in a color different from its surroundings, a faint green bruise upon the earth. The photograph made before nightfall became a talisman in reverse. Copies appeared in shop windows for a week as a caution and were then taken down out of decency. One was placed in the vestry, face inward, to be studied only when a visitor insisted. In homes, versions were kept in drawers, wrapped in paper, brought out in winter evenings when someone's sorrow wanted witnesses. Letters threaded outward along the rail lines. A sister in Derbyshire received not her brother but his watch, stopped at a time she would memorize and later confuse with the hour of her own wedding. A widow in Leeds learned that the sovereign she had pressed into her husband's palm for luck lay now in a magistrate's envelope, catalogued between child's tin whistle and pair of gloves, damp. Families who did not know the show had been in town, read of the calamity in gazettes weeks later, and felt a shiver for having been spared by ignorance. What remained unsettled, what always remains, was the story's ownership. Who would tell it and how? The newspapers preferred a clean arc. The hazard of itinerant entertainments, the caprice of weather, the sad lesson of insufficient caution. But at the alehouse tables other versions endured. Men spoke of the strong man's last shape. Women repeated with a kind of fierce tenderness that the contortionist had died near the flap, which meant she had almost made her way through with a child behind her. A farmer insisted he had felt the ground jump an instant before the mast broke, and that the earth, not the air, had begun it. Such explanations comforted in their precision. Season turned. By Christmas, frost had washed the field clean. The mast's stump, left as a memorial of practicality, gathered snow that melted last, a white collar about a dark throat. The troupe's wagons, what was left of them, were sold at a fair price to a man who meant to use the sound wheels for coal. He did not take the painted panels. Those were burned, the smoke carrying for an hour, a faint sweetness of varnish and paste that made the town turn its head and then pretend it had not. The photograph endured. On its back, the photographer had written with a craftsman's pride the date, the place, and the number of faces. Someone else's hand added later a column of crosses. In that marginalia sits the whole account, a day reduced to marks, a calamity converted into arithmetic that never quite balances. The image does not accuse, it does not absolve. It simply holds the last arrangement of people who believed there would be another arrangement to follow. If you look long enough, you begin to notice what the first glance misses: a scarf caught mid-fall from a girl's shoulder, a button missing from a giant's waistcoat, a man at the edge who has turned his head a fraction only towards something just outside the frame. Perhaps it was the wind, perhaps it was the future, making itself felt as a pressure behind the ear. There is more, always more. The petitions filed and forgotten, the small pension granted and then rescinded when a clerk changed offices, the coroner's addendum that never saw print. But the field is quiet now, and the story told to its end asks only to be remembered without ornament. What failed that night was wood and weather, and the human habit of assuming that what has stood will go on standing. What failed afterward was attention. Shall I go on with the final movement? How the legal word settled into habit, how the town taught its children to live beside a fact too large for a plackie, and how the photograph, softened at the edges by time, became the only witness that cannot forget. In the weeks that followed the burials, the town fell under a peculiar stillness. Not the kind that signals peace, but that heavier quiet born of exhaustion, when words cannot yet shape themselves into meaning. The disaster had left no enemy, no villain upon whom to rest the blame, and so the people turned their gaze inward. Men who had lifted the dead now lifted hammers again. Women who had scrubbed faces in lavender water returned to wash their children's shirts. The lanes filled once more with the scent of coal fires, and yet, in every doorway, conversation faltered where it approached the matter of the tent. For the local papers, the calamity became an embarrassment of ink. The first issues had sold in haste, columns crowded with witnesses' fragments, illustrations drawn from memory. But by the second week, the headlines thinned. By the third, mention of the event had been replaced by the usual fare of council disputes and livestock prices. Tragedy, once it has exhausted novelty, begins to feel indecent. The editors understood the mood. They printed a brief notice of thanksgiving for the generosity of the county and then turned the page. In the magistrate's archive, the coroner's report was filed away under the year's ordinary accidents. Industrial mishap, mine collapse, one drowned in quarry pit. No special heading marked the field or its 40 names. The ledger treated them all alike, a column of tally marks on a page that would never be turned by curious hands. And yet memory is stubborn. Those who had seen too much could not forget, though they learned to speak of it only in fragments. Children overheard half-stories at the hearth. A great tent that came down like a wave, a woman who sang as the wind tore the roof away, a man who was found standing though his heart had stopped. By such retellings, the disaster slipped its boundaries of fact and entered the low folklore of the district. Farmhands refused to cut timber from the trees that bordered the field, saying the wood had tasted sorrow and would warp in the saw. Fishermen on the river claimed that on nights when the air was close, they heard a tune drifting from the meadows, a faint thread of circus music carried by no wind they could name. A superstition grew that the grass would not thrive where the mast had stood, and for years it remained a patch of sullen color, different from its surroundings. The photographer who had taken the portrait left the county not long after the inquest. He carried with him his equipment and, wrapped in brown paper, the glass plate that had captured the troupe. He told a publican before he departed that he could no longer abide the smell of developer's fluid, that it reminded him of the rain-soaked canvas and the way the air had stung his eyes that night. The plate, he said, was a reminder of a thing better buried. But he could not bring himself to destroy it. He kept it in his trunk, and with time it became his sole companion, the last piece of work he never dared to print again. Years passed. The field was sold, plowed, and replanted. New cottages rose nearby, each with clean windows and tidy hedges. The road was straightened. The ditch that had bordered the fairground was filled with stone. Children played there again, though for their parents still spoke the old warning, never after dusk, never when the wind came down from the hills. By the turn of the century, only the eldest could point to the exact spot. The rest knew it only as the Hollow Place, a name that meant nothing and everything. In London, a pamphlet appeared briefly, anonymously printed, its cover marked only with the words "On the Perils of Temporary Structures." It quoted without attribution from witness statements taken at the inquest, but the tone was curiously impersonal, as though the writer sought not to recount human suffering, but to measure stress and torque. The pamphlet circulated among engineers, then vanished into libraries where the dust of progress soon covered it. What was once grief had become data. What had been horror became instruction. Meanwhile, the survivors, those who had lost kin or friends that night, carried their mourning into the small, unnoticed corners of life. A widow who had served tea to rescuers began each autumn to place a single lantern in her window on the anniversary of the collapse. She never spoke of its meaning, and the neighbors, out of respect or fear of contagion, did not ask. A schoolmaster, who had pulled 3 children alive from the wreckage, took to walking the field each Sunday before service. He left no flowers, no cross, only footprints that returned the way they came. By the time Queen Victoria herself was laid to rest, the tragedy had passed beyond living recollection. The field had changed hands twice, and the new owner, an industrialist from Liverpool, built a summer house there, unaware of what foundation his workers disturbed. During excavation, they uncovered a length of rusted chain and a handful of glass marbles dulled by years in the soil. The foreman tossed them aside, and the work went on. The photograph remained hidden. After the photographer's death, his belongings were sold in bulk. The trunk, heavy and unremarkable, found its way to a warehouse near Preston, then to an antiques dealer who dealt in curiosities of no great value. There it slept for nearly half a century. It was not until 1932 that a historian named Lyle, an amateur collector of early photography, opened the box and found the plate wrapped in its brown paper, still bearing the faint scent of chemicals. He held it to the light and saw the company arrayed before him, the tall brothers, the contortionist, the ringmaster's proud stance, and the children with their grave expressions. He knew nothing of the collapse, only that he had found a fine example of Victorian field portraiture. He printed 3 copies and added one to his collection. But as he examined the image under a magnifying lens, something in it unsettled him. Perhaps it was the composition, the way the figures seemed drawn slightly forward, their eyes all fixed upon some invisible point just above the photographer's shoulder. Perhaps it was the strange uniformity of their expressions, calm, almost expectant, like those who know that stillness is their only defense. He could not say. He filed it under miscellaneous Circus troops C.1880S, and made a note to research their history. He never did. Decades would pass again before the photograph surfaced once more, this time in an exhibition devoted to the lost entertainments of the 19th century. By then, its story had all but evaporated. Visitors read the small card beside the print and saw only nostalgia, a window into an age of wonders and simplicity. No one knew they were looking at the final testament of 37 lives. Memory had at last achieved its most complete disguise. It had become art. By the middle of the 20th century, the photograph had passed through enough hands to lose its provenance entirely. Collectors admired its craftsmanship, its depth of field, the steadiness of those 37 faces. It hung for a time in a small provincial museum, labeled only Traveling Circus, circa 1880s photographer unknown. Visitors walked past, pausing, perhaps to smile at the quaintness of Victorian showmanship, unaware that they were meeting ghosts. When the museum closed for renovation in the 1970s, the print was boxed and misfiled. It slept again. Another generation of silence. Cardboard darkened around it. Labels fell away. The archivist who rediscovered it 40 years later was not looking for tragedy at all, but for examples of early wet plate printing. She lifted the photograph from its wrapping, held it to the window, and felt that old, uneasy sensation known only to those who have stumbled upon something that remembers more than they do. It was the eyes. Though the exposure had blurred many of the finer details, the eyes of the subjects remained clear, each pair fixed on a point just beyond the viewer's shoulder, as though they saw what was coming. The archivist noted the location, Barrowford, Lancashire, and began to search parish records for the troupe's name. What she found was confusion. No company of that title registered, no deaths listed for the year given. But she was patient, and the past, when approached gently, sometimes stirs itself. A week later, in a county ledger under industrial calamities, 1887, she found it. A single line entered by a clerk in faded ink collapse of temporary structure, 37 fatalities. Weather exceptional. Inquiry concluded. There were no names, no details, no mention of a tent or a show. But she knew. She followed the trail to the coroner's office, to a basement where the air smelled of mildew and old type. There, in a box marked Miscellaneous, 1880s, she found the missing testimony. Pages browned by time, edges curled like petals. The words were terse, the handwriting steady. Each line carried the quiet restraint of those who write what they must, not what they feel. Reading through the depositions, she began to reconstruct the story, the crack in the mast, the storm, the collapse, the futile rescue, the names half spelled in the dark. She read until the letters blurred, then went home and dreamt of falling canvas. A month later, she returned to the field itself. It was no longer a field, but a row of modern houses, their gardens bright with lilac and trimmed hedges. Only the line of the horizon remained unchanged, the same soft dip of earth where the tent had once stood. She walked the verge until dusk. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear, only that persistent hum that old places sometimes have, a faint resonance of what they were asked to hold. In the years that followed, she published a brief paper, careful and factual, on a neglected catastrophe of the late Victorian era. It made no headlines. History seldom thanks those who disturb its sleep. But among historians of social life, the story began to circulate once more. The fairground disaster that had disappeared from record, the photograph that prefigured it. Scholars traced the missing names. Descendants came forward hesitantly, uncertain whether to claim or to disown their kin. Each discovery added another thread, another small act of restitution. When the photograph was finally exhibited again, in a London gallery devoted to the lost Victorians, the curator chose to hang it alone on a white wall. No frame, no decoration, just the stark image, the simple label. Group Portrait, Travelling Show, Lancashire, 1887. Beside it, a single line from the coroner's report. The structure failed entirely. Visitors lingered in the hush that always gathers around unspoken history. Some looked away quickly, uncomfortable under so many eyes. Others leaned closer, as though distance could be undone by sympathy. And one or two, those with the habit of listening, swore they could almost hear it. The faint flap of canvas, the whisper of ropes under tension, the sigh of an audience taking its seats before the world ends. The photograph is still there, somewhere, in the nation's archives, filed, catalogued, safe. You can see it if you ask correctly, though the clerks will tell you there is little to learn from it now. Yet when the image catches the light, a trick of old chemistry brings back the glint of rain in the air that day, and for a moment the dead reclaim their names. The strong man, the contortionist, the brothers who flew above the ring, the children at the edges, they are all waiting perfectly still as they were told to be. And so the photograph keeps its vigil. It endures the way the best records do, silent, exact, indifferent to interpretation. But for those who have heard the story, it has a voice of its own. It speaks of wood rot and weather, of ambition and neglect, of how quickly the ordinary becomes the unimaginable. It reminds us that calamity is not a matter of thunder and flame. It is a slow accumulation of disregard, ending in a single moment when everything gives way. The past once revealed asks nothing but remembrance. And if you listen carefully, as the archivist once did, you can still hear it. The whisper beneath the photograph's varnish, the faint suggestion of breath where none should remain. This was Deep Night Whispers. Tonight, a photograph has taught us that the difference between wonder and ruin is often just the thickness of a single beam, or the silence of a single witness. The show has ended, the tent has fallen. But in the stillness after, the light remains, waiting, patient, unblinking.